June 1944, about 1400 near Cesena, Italy. The Italian summer heat beats down on the dusty road leading north toward Livorno, baking the clay until it is nearly as hard as the asphalt that has long since been blasted away. For the men of the Fifth Army, the push up the peninsula has been a grinding, bloody affair, a slow crawl measured in yards rather than miles. But for the lead elements of the 228th Engineer Mine Detection Company, the danger is not just in the German artillery thundering in the distance or the snipers hidden in the cypress groves. The danger is right beneath their boots. Here, the war is silent until it isn't. The road to Cesena is a graveyard of armor and men, littered with the debris of a retreating enemy that has mastered the art of the rearguard action. The Germans have left behind a lethal gift for the advancing Americans: mines, thousands of them. But these are not the standard metallic discs that the heavy, humming SCR-625 detectors can easily pick up. These are the Schuh mines and the Hals mines, insidious devices encased in wood, glass, or bakelite. They contain almost no metal. To a magnetic detector, they are invisible. To a soldier stepping on a pressure plate, they are a maiming sentence, designed to tear off a foot or a leg, slowing the advance and demoralizing the squad. In this sector, the United States Army is trying something new, something desperate. Walking Point are not just engineers with probes, but handlers with leashes. This is the combat debut of the M-Dog program. A handler, sweat stinging his eyes under the rim of his helmet, watches his German shepherd work the verge of the road. The dog is one of approximately 100 animals attached to the 228th. The animal's nose is to the ground, ears twitching, moving in a sweeping pattern that was drilled into him back in the States. The handler trusts the dog. He has to. The Army has told him that this animal is the answer to the non-metallic mine, a biological sensor far more sophisticated than any electronics the Signal Corps can produce. But as the afternoon sun casts long shadows over the cratered landscape, the tension is brittle. The dog stops. It sits, the signal for a find. The column halts. An engineer moves up, gingerly prodding the earth with a bayonet or a non-magnetic probe, sweat dripping off his nose. He checks the spot. He checks again. Nothing. It is a false alarm. The column breathes, the handler tugs the leash, and they move another 10 yards. Then the dog ignores a patch of loose gravel. A moment later, a dull thump and a spray of dirt and blood shatter the rhythm of the march. The dog didn't signal. The mine was there. This operation near Cesena is one of the unit's first major tests in the European theater, and already the grim reality is setting in. The theory of the M-Dog is colliding violently with the chaos of the Italian front. To understand why men and dogs are dying on this dusty road in Tuscany, we have to look back to where this experiment began, and the fatal flaw that was baked into the program long before the 228th ever boarded a transport ship. The concept was born from a simple, almost pastoral observation. Dogs can find buried bones. If a canine could sniff out a bone hidden under 6 inches of garden soil, surely it could locate a mine filled with TNT. It was a seductive idea for the brass in Washington. The war in 1943 had shown that the Germans were innovating faster than Allied countermeasures could keep up. The non-metallic mine was becoming a scourge in North Africa and Sicily. The Army Corps of Engineers needed a solution, and they needed it yesterday. The K-9 Corps, officially established on March 13, 1942, had already begun proving the utility of dogs in sentry and scout roles. Civilian organizations like Dogs for Defense, Inc., spearheaded by breeders like Aline Stern-Erlanger, had mobilized the American public to donate their family pets to the war effort. By the thousands, Dobermans, Shepherds, Collies, and Retrievers were crated up and shipped to training centers. Out of some 19,000 dogs procured by the Quartermaster Corps, about 10,000 made the grade for service. But the M-Dog, the mine detection dog, was a different breed of soldier, requiring a level of discipline and sensory acuity that went far beyond walking a perimeter fence. The 228th Engineer Mine Detection Company, DOG, was activated in November 1943 to turn this concept into a tactical reality. The training grounds were at Fort Belvoir, Virginia, and later in San Carlos, California. In the rolling, green fields of Virginia, the conditions were controlled. The sun was mild, the grass was trimmed, and the silence was broken only by the commands of the trainers. Here lay the root of the tragedy unfolding in Italy. The Army training doctrine for M-dogs was based on a fundamental misunderstanding of what the dog was actually detecting. The trainers believed they were teaching the dogs to smell the mine itself, or perhaps the explosive filler. In reality, the dogs were being conditioned to detect disturbed earth. In a pristine Virginia field, a hole dug to bury a training mine smells different than the compacted soil around it. The microbes are exposed, the moisture content changes. A sharp-nosed dog can pick up that scent profile easily. The dogs were rewarded for finding these spots of disturbed earth. They were praised, fed, and reinforced. They became experts at finding where a man had recently dug a hole. But there were warning signs. In November 1943, during a key demonstration at Fort Belvoir for high-ranking officers, the cracks in the program were already visible to anyone willing to look past the novelty of the animals. In a test field seeded with dummy mines, the M-dogs missed 20% of the devices. Perhaps even more concerning, they generated a 20% false alert rate. In a classroom, an 80% grade is a solid pass. In a minefield, an 80% success rate means 1 out of every 5 soldiers steps on a trigger. Despite these statistics, the demand from the front was too high to ignore. The program was pushed forward. The 228th was declared combat-ready. The journey to the war was an ordeal in itself. On May 5, 1944, the company embarked from the United States. For nearly a month, the men and their 100 dogs endured the cramped, stifling holds of a troop transport. Seasickness was rampant among the animals. The stench in the holds was overpowering, a mix of wet fur, vomit, and anxiety. Handlers slept beside their animals, trying to keep them calm as the ship pitched and rolled across the Atlantic. They arrived in Oran, Algeria on May 30, 1944. It was a brief respite, a chance for the dogs to feel solid ground and for the handlers to stretch their legs in the North African heat. But there was no time for acclimation or retraining. The Fifth Army was bleeding in Italy, clawing its way up the boot, and the call came to move out. By June, the 228th was in Italy. Attached to the Fifth Army, the transition from the sterile training fields of the United States to the war-torn topography of Italy exposed the program's fatal flaw with brutal efficiency. When the 228th Engineer Mine Detection Company deployed to support the Fifth Army's advance, they did not step into a clean tactical puzzle. They stepped into a landscape that had been pulverized by months of static warfare and heavy artillery. The sector near Cesena, where the unit faced its first true trial by fire, offered a chaotic sensory overload that no amount of stateside drilling could have simulated. In Virginia, disturbed earth was a distinct anomaly, a patch of overturned soil in a meadow of green grass. In the combat zone leading to Livorno, the entire world was disturbed earth. The ground was a patchwork of shell craters, tank treads, foxholes, and trench lines. To a dog trained to alert on the scent of broken soil, the battlefield was one giant, confusing positive signal. As the platoon moved forward, the dogs began to falter. They alerted on shrapnel burials. They alerted on old latrines filled in by retreating troops. They alerted on the heavy, iron-rich scent of blood soaked into the dirt from skirmishes days prior. The handlers, tethered to their animals by 6-foot leather leads, found themselves stopping every few yards for signals that yielded nothing but jagged metal or empty ration cans. The infantry behind them, nerves already frayed by the constant threat of German snipers, grew restless. A mine detector that cries wolf a dozen times an hour is worse than useless. It is a liability that halts momentum and exposes the column to enemy fire. But the false positives were only half the problem. The false negatives, the silence when a mine was actually present, began to claim lives. The Germans were not merely digging holes and burying mines. They were masters of camouflage and deception. They used chemical irritants to mask scents, or simply relied on the overwhelming olfactory noise of the battlefield to hide their traps. The dogs, confused by the conflicting smells of cordite, rotting livestock, and burning diesel, began to miss the subtle cues they had mastered in California. The psychological toll on the animals was immediate and severe. The training program had not accounted for the sheer acoustic violence of the Italian front. The roar of friendly artillery firing overhead, the sharp crack of incoming mortar fire, and the grinding mechanical screech of Sherman tanks created an environment of constant terror. Handlers reported that their dogs, previously disciplined and eager, became neurotic. Some refused to work entirely, cowering at the sound of a distant explosion. Others became erratic, snapping at their handlers or pulling wildly on their leashes, their focus shattered by the cacophony of war. Casualties mounted quickly. The exact numbers were often swallowed by the bureaucratic fog of the front lines, recorded simply as losses within the 228th, but the impact was undeniable. When a dog missed a mine, the result was catastrophic. Handlers who walked closest to the danger often took the brunt of the blast. The bond between man and dog, forged during those long weeks in the ship's hold and the training fields of Fort Belvoir, added a tragic layer to the losses. These were not just equipment failures, they were partners dying together in the dust. By midsummer 1944, the situation had become untenable. The Fifth Army Command, pragmatic and results-oriented, could no longer ignore the disparity between the promise of the M-Dog and the reality on the ground. The advance towards the Arno River could not afford to be stalled by experimental failures. In a move to definitively assess the unit's viability, the Army ordered a controlled field test in Italy, away from the immediate heat of the line, but under conditions that mirrored the operational reality. The results of this test were a devastating indictment of the program's foundational science. Under the scrutiny of senior engineer officers, the dogs were run through a prepared course seeded with known mines. The outcome was worse than the 20% failure rate seen at Fort Belvoir. In the harsh light of the Italian summer, the dogs achieved a success rate of only 30%. 70% of the mines were either missed entirely or the result of false alerts. In the binary life-or-death calculus of mine clearance, a 30% success rate is effectively zero. It was a statistical confirmation of what the handlers of the 228th already knew in their gut. The dogs could not be trusted to clear a safe path for the infantry. The premise that a dog could reliably distinguish a buried mine from the thousands of other scents in a combat zone, solely based on the concept of disturbed earth, had collapsed. The fallout was swift. In September 1944, just 3 months after their hopeful arrival in the theater, the 228th Engineer Mine Detection Company was withdrawn from mine-clearing duties. The experiment was over. The unit, which had arrived with such fanfare as a secret weapon against the German engineers, was pulled off the line. The M-Dog designation, once a symbol of innovation, became a mark of a well-intentioned but ultimately disastrous misunderstanding of animal behavior and battlefield physics. The withdrawal of the 228th marked the effective end of the Mine Dog program in the European theater. While the dogs were removed from the front, the administrative machinery of the Army took longer to dismantle the unit. The company remained in a state of limbo until February 1945, when it was officially inactivated. The men and surviving dogs were shipped back to the United States, their mission unfulfilled. Post-war analysis would dissect the failure with clinical precision. The Quartermaster Corps and the Corps of Engineers eventually concluded that the failure lay not with the dogs, but with the men who designed the training. The reliance on disturbed earth, rather than the specific chemical signature of explosives, was the critical error. Furthermore, the training had been too rigid, relying on negative reinforcement and fear in the early stages, a stark contrast to the reward-based systems used by the British, or the more natural bonding methods used with scout dogs in the Pacific. It is important to contextualize this failure, however. While the M-Dog program in Italy was a disappointment, the broader K-9 Corps was finding immense success elsewhere. In the dense jungles of the Pacific Theater, scout dogs were proving invaluable. There, the environment favored the dog's natural instincts. A scout dog didn't need to find a specific mechanical trigger buried in the ground. It needed to detect the scent of a hidden enemy soldier or the rustle of an ambush. In the Pacific, the dog was an early warning system, not a mine detector. The difference was subtle but profound. One task required the dog to understand a complex, abstract concept, finding a hidden object that smelled like dirt, while the other relied on the primal instinct to detect a predator or prey. By the end of the war, the United States had procured some 18,000 dogs, with over 10,000 completing training for various roles. The quartermaster wore dog platoons, 15 of which were activated, with 7 serving in Europe and 8 in the Pacific, saved countless lives as sentries and scouts. The failure of the 228th was a specific, technical failure of a specific application, not a condemnation of the war dog concept. Yet, for the men of the 228th who walked the road to Livorno, the broader success of the Canine Corps offered no solace to the men standing in the mud of the Arno Valley. For the handlers of the 228th, the war had become a very personal, very specific tragedy. They were not reading reports about successful jungle patrols in Guadalcanal. They were looking at the empty spaces in their own ranks. They were holding leashes that no longer had a dog at the other end. When the order to stand down finally arrived in September 1944, it was met with a complex mix of relief and bitterness. The experiment was officially over. The dogs, once heralded as the answer to the Wehrmacht's invisible war, were pulled from the line. The men were exhausted, their nerves shredded not just by the enemy fire, but by the agonizing unpredictability of their own partners. The withdrawal was an admission of defeat, a rare thing for the U.S. Army to put on paper in the middle of a winning campaign. But the numbers from that summer test, that damnable 30% success rate, could not be spun. The unit didn't immediately dissolve, however. The Army is a machine that moves slowly, even when correcting a mistake. For months, the company existed in a strange administrative limbo. While the Fifth Army pushed north, grinding through the Gothic line and enduring the harsh Italian winter, the mine dog teams were relegated to the rear. They were soldiers without a mission, caretakers of animals that the military had deemed obsolete. Imagine the scene in a re-echelon encampment near Florence as the autumn rain set in. A handler, perhaps a young private from the Midwest who had grown up hunting with beagles, sits under a canvas tarp, cleaning his M1 Garand. Beside him lies a German Shepherd or a Doberman Pinscher, curled against the damp chill. The dog doesn't know it failed. It doesn't know that the disturbed earth it was trained to find is the wrong scent. It only knows the bond with the man. They share rations. They share the boredom. They share the memory of the explosions near Cesena. The tragedy of the M-Dog program wasn't just tactical. It was the betrayal of that interspecies contract. The dogs had done exactly what they were trained to do. The training itself was the lie. By February 1945, the paperwork finally caught up with reality. The 228th was officially inactivated. The men and the surviving dogs were loaded onto transports for the return journey to the United States. The mood on the ship home was starkly different from the hopeful, anxious energy that had filled the holds in May of the previous year. They were returning not as conquering heroes who had unlocked the secret to mine warfare, but as survivors of a flawed hypothesis. The dismantling of the unit triggered a period of intense introspection within the Quartermaster Corps. The failure in Italy was dissected by colonels and generals who needed to ensure that such a costly error wasn't repeated. The post-mortem analysis was scathing. It highlighted that the initial rush to deploy, driven by the desperate need to counter German mines, had bypassed essential scientific rigor. The reliance on negative reinforcement in the early training phases was called into question. Reports surfaced comparing the American methods to the British, who favored a strictly reward-based system. The British dogs, it was noted, seemed more stable under fire, less prone to the neurotic breakdowns that had plagued the 228th. But the most damning conclusion remained the fundamental science of detection. The Army had to accept that a dog finding a buried bone in a backyard was not the same mechanism as a dog finding a top mine in a combat zone. The disturbed earth, Q, was simply too generic for the industrial-scale destruction of modern warfare. It would take decades and significant advances in understanding canine olfaction before the military could reliably train dogs to alert on the vapor pressure of explosives themselves, rather than the dirt covering them. The M-Dog program of 1944 was, in essence, trying to run a marathon before it had learned to crawl. This failure, however, became a crucible for the broader war dog program. It forced a professionalization that had been lacking in the early, frantic days of 1942. When the K-9 Corps was first established, it was a ragtag operation relying heavily on civilian enthusiasm. Dogs for Defense, Inc., led by the indomitable Aline Stern Erlanger, had performed a miracle of logistics, sourcing some 18,000 dogs from patriotic American families. They accepted over 30 breeds initially, everything from Airedale Terriers to Dalmatians. If it had 4 legs and teeth, the Army gave it a look. But the logistical nightmare of maintaining 32 different breeds in the field became apparent quickly. A Great Dane eats differently than a collie. A coat that works in the Ardennes is a liability in the Pacific. The failure of the specialized mine dogs reinforced the need for standardization. By late 1944, the list of accepted breeds had been ruthlessly pruned down to just 7. The German Shepherd, the Belgian Sheepdog, the Doberman Pinscher, the Collie, the Siberian Husky, the Malamute, and the Eskimo Dog. The latter 3 were reserved almost exclusively for sledge and pack duties in the Arctic, leaving the Shepherds and Dobermans as the face of the fighting K-9 Corps. The Quartermaster Corps, under the guidance of officers like Lieutenant Colonel Clifford C. Smith, began to tighten its grip. The reliance on civilian procurement through Dogs for Defense was gradually phased out. By March 1945, just a month after the Mine Dog Unit was disbanded, the Army took over the entirety of procurement and training. The romantic notion of the family pet going off to war was replaced by a grim, efficient system of military working dog production. The sentimentality was stripped away, replaced by the hard lessons learned in the minefields of Italy. The legacy of the 228th is often overshadowed by the heroic stories of the scout dogs in the Pacific or the sentry dogs patrolling the coastlines. We prefer the stories of the dog that saves the platoon, the alert ears pricking up in the jungle silence, the wet nose catching the scent of a Japanese ambush. These are the narratives that fit comfortably into our understanding of the bond between man and beast. They validate the ancient contract. But the story of the mine dogs in Italy is the uncomfortable counter-narrative. It is the story of what happens when that contract is stretched beyond the biological limits of the animal, forced into a mechanical role it was never designed to fill. While the engineers in Italy were struggling with false positives and neurotic animals, the war in the Pacific was proving the validity of the K-9 concept, provided the application was correct. In the dense vegetation of Bougainville or the rocky terrain of Okinawa, the dog was not asked to be a mine detector. It was asked to be a dog. The quartermaster wore dog platoons, 8 of which served in the Pacific compared to the 7 in Europe, operated on a different philosophy. Here, the enemy was biological. A hidden sniper breathes. A waiting ambush party sweats. These are scents that trigger a predator's natural prey drive, not the confused anxiety of a disturbed earth drill. Consider a scout dog team moving through the humid twilight of a Philippine jungle. The handler, a corporal perhaps, moves with a slack leash, his eyes not on the ground but on the dog's shoulders. The dog, likely a German Shepherd or a Doberman, stops. It doesn't bark. Barking is a death sentence here. It simply stiffens. The hackles rise. The ears swivel forward like radar dishes locking onto a signal. This is the alert. It is silent, primal, and unmistakable. The dog has smelled the enemy long before the human eye could see the camouflage. In this context, the dog is not a tool failing to find a buried metal box. It is a partner extending the soldier's senses. The success of the Pacific Scout dogs was not a matter of better training than the mine dogs received. It was a matter of better biology. The Army was working with the animals' instincts, not against them. This distinction, however, was hard-won. The road to a professional K-9 Corps was paved with logistical nightmares that dwarfed the specific failure of the mine detection experiment. When the call first went out in 1942, the military had almost no institutional knowledge of dog handling. The response from the American public was overwhelming, driven by the civilian organization Dogs for Defense, Inc., under the leadership of Aline Stern Erlanger, a breeder who understood the potential of the animal better than most generals. The organization mobilized the nation's pet owners. It was a patriotic frenzy. Families donated their beloved pets, believing they were sending them off to serve as guards and sentries. By the time the mine dogs were failing in Italy, the Army had procured approximately 18,000 dogs through this volunteer system. But procurement was only the first hurdle. The sheer variety of animals flooding into the reception centers created a chaotic menagerie that the Quartermaster Corps struggled to manage. In the early days, the Army accepted 32 different breeds. The list was a testament to optimism over practicality. It included Airedale Terriers, Dalmatians, Boxers, and even Great Danes. The reality of the field quickly whittled this list down. A Great Dane, while imposing, was a logistical burden. It required massive amounts of food and was a large target. A Dalmatian, while intelligent, lacked the weather-resistant coat necessary for a winter campaign in the Ardennes. The smaller terriers, though tenacious, couldn't physically subdue a man or navigate the rough terrain at the speed of an infantry march. The attrition rate was high. Of the 19,000 dogs eventually procured by the Quartermaster Corps between 1942 and 1945, roughly 45% were rejected as unsuitable for training. They were too gun-shy, too aggressive, too passive, or physically unsound. By late 1944, as the mine dog unit was being pulled from the line in Italy, the Army had ruthlessly standardized the K-9 Corps. The list of 32 breeds was slashed to 7. The German Shepherd became the backbone of the Corps, valued for its intelligence, loyalty, and all-weather coat. The Belgian Sheepdog and the Doberman Pinscher filled out the tactical ranks. The Collie, Siberian Husky, Malamute, and Eskimo Dog were retained, but largely for specialized sled and pack duties in the northern latitudes. The romantic idea of a ragtag army of mutts had been replaced by a standardized weapons system, with the German Shepherd as the M1 Garand of the canine world. The training pipeline, too, had to be industrialized. A typical war dog's training program ran from 8 to 12 weeks. It was a grueling process designed to strip the pet out of the animal and replace it with the discipline of a soldier. At centers like Front Royal, Virginia, or San Carlos, California, dogs learned to ignore the sound of gunfire, a process called battle inoculation. They were exposed to the rattle of small arms, the concussive thump of distant artillery, and the acrid smoke of smoke grenades. A dog that bolted at a backfire was a liability. A dog that cowered was useless. The instructors, a mix of professional trainers and hastily converted soldiers, looked for steady nerves. It was a brutal sorting process. Of the 19,000 dogs procured by the Quartermaster Corps between 1942 and 1945, nearly 45% were rejected. They were washed out, returned to their owners, or found new homes, deemed unfit for the rigors of combat. The Army could not afford to ship a neurotic animal halfway across the world only to have it freeze on a beachhead. The training curriculum itself was a marvel of rapid adaptation. In those 8 to 12 weeks, the animal had to unlearn the habits of a domestic pet. It was no longer about fetching a stick or guarding a porch. It was about controlled aggression and absolute obedience. The basic course covered heel, sit, cover, and stay, commands that had to be obeyed instantly, even with a mortar round impacting 200 yards away. Following this, the dogs were tracked into specialized roles. While the mine detection experiment was struggling to find its footing, the other branches of the K-9 Corps were solidifying their doctrine. Sentry dogs, scout dogs, messenger dogs, and casualty dogs, each required a different temperament. The sentry dog, often used by the Coast Guard to patrol the lonely stretches of American beaches, was trained to be a hair-trigger alarm. By the peak of operations, some 3,174 dogs were assigned to the Coast Guard for this specific purpose. They walked the dunes of the Atlantic and Pacific coasts, a living radar against saboteurs or U-boat landings. These animals were taught to work on a short leash, to growl or bark at the slightest anomaly in the wind. They were the blunt instruments of the Corps, designed for intimidation and detection in the dark. But the scout dog, the role that would eventually redeem the concept of the war dog in the eyes of the infantry, required a higher degree of finesse. This was the role that would see the most success in the Pacific Theater, where 8 war dog platoons were eventually deployed. Unlike the sentry, the scout dog had to work in silence. A bark in the jungle was a beacon for Japanese mortars. These dogs were trained to alert silently, a stiffening of the body, the raising of hackles, or pointing with the nose. Imagine the training ground at San Carlos in late 1943. A handler, sweating in his fatigues, moves through a simulated jungle course. The vegetation is thick, the visibility less than 10 yards. Ahead, concealed in a spider hole, an instructor waits with a blank-loaded rifle. The dog, a Doberman Pinscher, trots ahead on a long leather lead. The handler watches the dog's gait, the set of its ears. Suddenly, the Doberman stops. It doesn't look back at the handler, its focus is locked on a clump of ferns 20 feet away. The ears prick forward, the tail goes rigid. The handler drops to one knee, raising his hand to signal the squad behind him. This was the silent alert. If the dog barked, it failed. If the handler missed the cue, they both died in the simulation. It was a dance of nonverbal communication that had to be perfected before the team ever stepped on a transport ship. This intense bonding process created a unique dynamic within the military hierarchy. The handler and the dog were a single weapon system. You could swap a rifle, you could replace a jeep, but you could not swap a dog. The animal worked for its man, not for the army. If a handler was wounded or killed, the dog often became unworkable, refusing to take commands from anyone else. This biological reality forced the Quartermaster Corps to rethink its replacement policies. You didn't just issue a new dog to a soldier, you had to issue a new team. The logistical backbone of this entire enterprise was the civilian organization, Dogs for Defense. In the early years, before the military fully industrialized its own breeding and procurement, the Army relied entirely on the patriotism of the American dog owner. It is a staggering thought. 18,000 families voluntarily handed over their pets to the government. They signed waivers, said their goodbyes, and sent their shepherds and collies off to war, often with nothing more than a promise that the dog would be returned, if possible. Aline Stern Erlanger, the driving force behind Dogs for Defense, understood the gravity of this transaction. She wasn't just moving inventory, she was managing a national emotional investment. She worked tirelessly to ensure that the dogs were treated with a level of care that was, frankly, unusual for military livestock. But as the war dragged on, the limitations of this volunteer model became clear. The Army needed specific types of dogs, young, healthy, aggressive males of specific breeds, and the civilian supply was inconsistent. By March 1945, the Quartermaster Corps finally took over the entire procurement process, ending its reliance on Dogs for Defense. The era of the patriotic pet was over. The era of the military working dog had truly begun. This shift was driven by the hard data coming back from the field. While the mine detection units in Italy were generating reports of failure and frustration, the reports from the Pacific were glowing. In the island-hopping campaigns, where the terrain was dense and the enemy masters of camouflage, the scout dog was often the difference between a successful patrol and a massacre. Consider the experience of the 25th Quartermaster War Dog Platoon on Bougainville. The jungle there was a green hell, a place where visual contact was often limited to arm's length. Japanese patrols moved with ghostly silence, but they could not mask their scent. The scout dog's working point repeatedly alerted to ambushes that human scouts had walked right past. They detected the sweat, the gun oil, the faint odor of rice cooking deep in the bush. The soldiers learned quickly, trust the dog. If the dog stops, you stop. If the dog looks left, the enemy is left. There is a documented instance where a scout dog named Caesar, a German shepherd, alerted his handler to a Japanese position on a ridge line. The platoon halted. The handler, trusting the animal implicitly, called for mortar fire on the coordinates the dog was indicating. The subsequent patrol found a destroyed machine gun nest that had been waiting in perfect ambush. Caesar hadn't seen the gun. He had smelled the men manning it. This was the vindication of the K9 concept. It wasn't about finding mines, a static chemical task. It was about finding life. The success in the Pacific stood in stark contrast to the disappointment in Italy. It highlighted a fundamental truth about animal utility. Biology dictates mission. The mine dogs failed because they were asked to perform a task that was abstract and chemically confusing. The scout dogs succeeded because they were asked to do what their ancestors had done for 10,000 years: hunt. The Army had learned that you cannot simply order a dog to be a mine detector in the same way you order a soldier to be a radio man. You have to leverage the animal's natural drives. By the time the 228th was inactivated in February 1945, the K9 Corps had matured. The 15 active war dog platoons, 7 in Europe, 8 in the Pacific, were lean, professional units. The chaotic mix of breeds had been distilled down. The training manuals had been rewritten in blood and experience. The Army had learned that a dog is not a machine, but a biological sensor with limitations and specificities that must be respected. The end of the war brought a new challenge: demobilization. What do you do with thousands of dogs trained to kill? The public, the families who had donated their pets, wanted them back, but the Army was cautious. A rigorous detraining program was established to ensure these combat veterans could safely transition from the battlefield to the backyard. Only after proving they could leave their lethal training behind were the dogs finally allowed to return to the families waiting for them. If you would like more war stories from World War II, please like this video and subscribe to our channel.